I would like now to welcome Chris Coleman. Chris Coleman um, uh, is a member of our steering committee for the symposium. He's also the director of the Advanced Computing Center for the Arts and Design. So welcome, Chris. I can see you're sharing your screen, so that means it works on your side, right?
I hope so. If you're
Sure.
seeing it, then we're good to go.
Okay,
Uh,
so I will briefly tell a bit more about you. So you were born in the West Virginia and you received an MFA from SUNY SUNY Buffalo in New York. So Chris's artwork includes sculptures, animations, creative coding, and interactive installations, all focused on complex systems and how they are used for control. Chris's work has been in exhibitions and festivals in more than 25 countries, a long list of them. And after a decade of creating and contributing to open source software tools for the arts, he created the Clinic for Open Source Arts to support other contributors and communities. The clinic was initially funded with a grant from the Knight Foundation and has since received 5 grants from the National Endowments for the Arts, as well as funding from the Mellon Foundations and other donors. He is a professor of art and technology, and as I said, the director of ACCAD at the Ohio State University. So thank you very much, Chris. The floor is yours.
all right. And thank you very much, Gaetan, and everybody else who has been doing the behind the scenes work, making all of this happen. Um, I'm going to talk about slow and local AI. This emerges from a class that I taught in the fall. Um, I titled it Creative Generative AI because of a lack of trying to figure out what we even call this thing yet. I will say that uh, I want to recognize that, a lot of the lessons that I learned as I tried to formulate this class and experiment with this class. I also gathered wisdom from Golan Levin over at Carnegie Mellon, who's done a couple iterations of a similar class, as well as Derek Schultz, who's been doing some really great online tutorial systems about using some of these tools. Um, all of us teachers are also always taught by other teachers, so I want to appreciate that lineage. Um, the primary tool for the course was ComfyUI, which many of you probably know of. It's a node-based tool that's free and open source. I think really the big requirement for doing the course was that we had computers with solid GPUs. In this case, we were running some fairly old 5000 NVIDIA 5000 GPU chips. This is pre-Ada, pre-Blackwell. So they're a little bit older, but still plenty for us to do this kind of work. Um, why choose ComfyUI? Other than the fact that like a node-based tool is always really friendly to artists. You're not having to teach students how to code in the sort of textual way. But one of the really great things about it is you can run everything locally. You can download all the models that are free and open weight or open source, however you want to term that. You can pull all of those down, store them locally. You can run them locally. All of this stuff is free. We didn't spend any money for this particular class. And the benefit to all of that is that all of the student data is completely secure, which is a huge thing here in the United States, especially. And it meant that students knew that their data wasn't being used to then train other systems. Again, another huge concern with the art students here in this area. Um, I talked about it being node-based. I think the other piece that ComfyUI really unpacked for the students was the fact that it really allowed us to dive in pretty deeply to the interface. one of the problems with using the off-the-shelf tools that are available is that they don't let you get in and say change the CG numbers or really understand how the random seed is affecting things. But in this case, because we see every node, we can have these deeper discussions. I mean, some of these pieces or some of these discussions go beyond just using a diffusion model, but it's like, okay, we learned about VAEs, which are basically encoders and decoders for vector space. So we could have a long conversation about vector space. So it was really conducive to sort of diving deep into all the parts of how these systems actually work. And then the other piece of it was that it was a real big invitation to the students to understand just how dynamic the field was. The models were changing on a weekly basis. The software was changing on a weekly basis. It was really tremendous to just watch the class sort of continually react to what was happening in the field. We would start on a Monday with a set of announcements of the things that had happened over the weekend, and the students had a real sort of close connection to, yeah, what was happening. So the other pieces that I really loved about this is because we were running locally on a computer that was sitting in front of the student, they had to learn patience. There was no magic. You weren't sending your files into the cloud and then magic comes back. The magic slop machine, churns out some sort of solution and sends it back to you. Instead, they had to sort of like wait on the computer. And the computer would sit there and you could hear it spin up. You could hear the fans go full bore and you could feel the heat coming out of it. So there's a real physical experience with the computation that they were asking the computer to do. And I felt like that was really important for the students to understand just what they were doing when they were asking for another picture or a video or a song. That this was very real electricity and heat and computing process. And finally, just the overall set of systems thinking that was involved in this. Um, in ComfyUI is it really allowed you to, because of the node-based system, it allowed you to sort of think about consequences and cascades as you were feeding in different bits of data and different points of control into a bigger system. Um, so I'm going to give you a couple of the assignments that I gave and why, and hopefully this will be insightful to others. I'm a little bit inspired by this conversation because of this great book that Golan and Tega released. Um, this book is one of the reasons it's code as a creative medium. I think it's inspirational to this conference that we're even having. It took whatever 50 years for them to emerge, for this book to emerge in our field, in terms of helping us all think about these challenges. And I don't know, maybe we can do that loop a little bit quicker. All that is to say, our first assignment that we did was our first major assignment was actually a self-portrait, which I thought was a really interesting provocation because it gave the students a very specific kind of goal. They were allowed to do two versions of a self-portrait, and they did a few different iterations. One was a sort of outside or descriptive version of a self-portrait. Um, and one was a sort of internal version of who they are. So the like what you look like versus who you are. I think it was a really beautiful and interesting challenge for them to try and to describe themselves into very specific words, and try and see where the system failed to understand the nuances of that description of a person. And so like understanding the difference between a description and a prompt. And then the second half of this was like talking about like who they are, like the essence of themselves, which came down to like weird things like hobbies and stuff like that. You'll see this emerge in a couple of the examples. But again, the failure of like the clip system to actually understand contexts and deeper, more complex notions of what it means to be human. We wanted to like play with and think about that failure. And so you saw stuff like this where a younger student, uh, was finding that everything was trying to position her as a 20-year-old supermodel. We were using pretty rudimentary models at this stage. Um, and then when she was trying to get to her essence, she would get these much more creative solutions. Other students of international, from international backgrounds, actually found a lot more difficulty because the representations of what is Pakistani versus Indian versus all of the nuances of what it means to come from different parts of Pakistan or India were actually significant failures in the prompts and positions. And you can see even here, to the left is his attempt to describe himself, and to the right is his sort of internal nature. And the moment he started adding soccer, it wanted to make him much more Asiatic. It was having trouble compiling the idea of being from Pakistan and liking soccer. So you started to see really the edges of failure in some interesting ways. We also had a couple of our older students here. We have a 60 plus program for people who are over 60 can take free classes at the university, which is really a delightful experience. And they really found that the system could not understand what maybe a 60-year-old person looked like. It was like either you were 20 or you were 80. And there was a real sort of failure around a sort of broader range of aging and how to depict aging. That was quite interesting. Moving on to another assignment, which was about future cultures. Um, this was a sort of, again, I'm simultaneously trying to combine these sort of conceptual ideas with technical exercises. In this particular case, we were really interested in control nets. Control nets being a way that you can actually give the students more authorship over how an image emerges, as opposed to purely just text prompting. I think the text prompting is actually a very limiting system, and I wasn't too interested in having the students be restrained by that artistically. And so for this assignment, they actually had to sort of portray three different cultures that all existed in the same world. It had to be at least 30 years into the future. So there had to be continuity across the different cultures, but there had to be differentiation between the different cultures. Um, and as part of this, for each culture, they would have to depict what the people looked like. And for this, they would use a PoseNet system. They would have to show what their housing or homes look like, where they live. For this, they would use a depth control net. And finally, they would have to depict a device that was central to this culture. And they would use a candy net for this. And just to say this briefly, the pose net, you actually feed it a photograph of a person who is posed in the sort of pose that you would like to reuse with your final output. So that pose is transferred, but not the person. The second one, the depth net, is really quite interesting because you can even just arrange some boxes and speakers and objects on a desk and take a photograph and use that as a depth map that then emerges on the other side as a sort of city block, if you want to, just to give you an example. So that you could really take cinematic directorship of how you wanted to portray that particular world. And finally, Canny is a pretty simple space where it can either take a photograph and do a line drawing derived from that photograph of just outlines and then reuse those outlines to drive the diffusion system. Or you can actually just submit a line drawing, and the line drawing itself can be the thing that drives the diffusion system. So again, just encouraging the students to really take control over their image making with these diffusion systems. This took a lot of forms. We got a lot of pretty wild and interesting combinations of different cultures. Different students understood this a different way. It was also interesting. All of these students were at the graduate or above level, and there was only one who was technically an artist, I suppose, and the rest were computer science students, art education students, people who were really thinking, yeah, beyond purely the goal of becoming an artist. But you can see a lot here where they would take people, or they would take, I would actually encourage them to take their own photographs of people posing in the pose that they want their characters to take on. And then, you would see the results. And then a final assignment that I'll talk about here is this sort of um, uh, self-inspiration. This is where we did LoRa training, which I think Terrence also talked some about. I think so. The nature of LoRa training, just in case somebody on here doesn't know, the idea is that students can develop a small data set, typically, 20 to 200 images is plenty. And you can actually run this through a training protocol on a decent computer. This only takes a couple of hours. And then that is a sort of powerful layer that can um, sit over top of a larger diffusion system, a billion, a model that's trained on a billion images and costs $1 billion or whatever these are costing these days. So you're not training something completely from scratch like we were in the GAN days, and instead you're doing this training in a much more surface level. The students reported that this was the moment that they felt most like they were authoring something. It felt most authentic to them, that they were really yeah, they felt like they had agency at this point, even though we had been talking about lots of different kinds of agency. This is where they were like, "Oh, this is mine." Like I finally figured out how to make something that's mine, and I think that was a pretty important conversation to have with them. And so some of them, who did have more artistic backgrounds, were driving or developing LoRa's with their own artwork or bodies of art. Other students had to draw from other people because they just don't have that. And then we also talked a lot about combining LoRa's to actually, so you can feed multiple LoRa's together and play with the balance of those. And that actually also was able to drive some new aesthetic spaces for them as well. And you'll see some of that here, some students who are doing some really beautiful work in this kind of like hyper future, but super, 1800s painting styles. It was really quite beautiful. A sort of robotic future operating lab, but yeah, done in this, yeah, gorgeous painterly style. Um, People who were playing a lot with much more graphical elements, but finding new spaces that maybe violated the original rules of what these graphics artists were trying to do. And then here, again, the artist in the class was really steering this with a lot of her work, to see what new things emerged from that. She actually ended up then training LoRa's on the results from her LoRa's, and then making another LoRa from the results of that LoRa, and really finding some beautiful latent space where the computer was just like training on itself, on itself, on itself. And it actually emerged in a space that she was quite happy with as a new sort of aesthetic practice. And it's something that she's pursuing in the longer term. So I think that was actually quite interesting to just sort of go down the rabbit hole even a little bit deeper. All that is to say, it was a really interesting experiment. I think there are some drawbacks that should be said here. Um, while I loved the fact that the students really had to deal with the reality of what they were doing when it came to the computation, uh, when it came to switch gears and do some video, which they were all crazy excited to do, like I spent all semester just sort of pushing off the video till later and later because we were just learning so much in sort of really detailed ways. We finally got the video, and it's like, yeah, you fire off a test video on a local computer, and that's a half an hour. And so, in a 3 hour class, you get 3 or 4 pulls of the slot machine, and maybe you like what came out the other end, maybe you didn't. And it just didn't allow for the kind of iteration that is kind of necessary for these systems. And so we had to have big conversations about some of the students decided that that was okay, and they were just going to have to accept what came out of that, or they were going to have to spend more time. And some of the students were like, man, I don't have time for this. I'm going to get, a subscription to, Google's system, and I'm going to play with Flow. So, I let them sort of loose at the end. And so some of them just turned to the cloud and, had the magic come back into their lives and solve their problems. But it was an interesting question towards the end of the class. I will say also, not every student really took to the sort of rabbit hole of ComfyUI. I think they all learned deeply, but some of them never got past the point of like, I'm using the templates I was provided, and I'm tweaking the templates, but I'm not making new systems. So like the class was kind of half and half. Half of them were like, okay, I understand what you've been saying, and now I can say like use a LoRa plus a canny control net, and I understand how I can weave these together. And then the other half of the class was just, yeah, they walked away from it. So those are the costs. And finally, it really kind of, even though it was really amazing that ComfyUI and working in this dynamic space was a very authentic experience of the field, the weekly updates coming out of ComfyUI would break things constantly. And because, every time you start ComfyUI, it goes, there's an update, and all you have to do is hit yes. And the next thing you know, we're spending a half an hour figuring out why it won't start anymore. So it's dangerous. Be careful. Uh, uh, our future with this, I think some lessons emerged from this, one of which was we were actually really interested in ComfyUI on a larger level. So like I think there's something very interesting in having a class in this space, but I'm also really, really interested in ComfyUI as a kind of tool making space, specifically for developing workflows or tools for classes that don't want to learn ComfyUI, but also we don't want to pay a subscription to Runway or whatever for these sort of very specific tools. And I love how ComfyUI lets you make a quick bespoke tool and then distribute that, and everything can be kind of drag and drop, adjust the slider. You can really adjust how the access works. So all that is to say is we have a sort of local cluster with some great GPUs here at the university. They're spinning up a local cloud version of ComfyUI with some dedicated GPUs. And the idea is that your data is still all secure. It's still relatively local. We can have logins, but when the class that is doing storyboards comes to me and says we would really love to integrate AI storyboarding into what we're doing. Can you make something that my students can do a basic pencil sketch and output a sort of colorized, slightly better version, because they're not artists, but they need to be able to tell the stories. Can you make a quick AI tool that can do that? And I can say yes. And here's the cloud login. Doesn't matter whether or not you got computers. The students can even do this at home as homework on their iPad. So I'm really interested in how these sort of meta tools can be spun up locally at the university, and that we can do that kind of work. But it's going to require more support to do that. So yeah, Thank you.